Well, hello everybody. Jesse Dukes here, and I am here to give you a quick review of the new-ish novel When the Moon Hits Your Eye by John Scalzi. Now, why am I reviewing a novel rather than talking with Chris Bagg? Well, it's a new segment we're experimenting with. I read a lot of books, Chris reads a lot of books, and we thought it might be interesting to see what happened if we occasionally reviewed and made recommendations. So, we'll see if you like it or not. The other obvious question is, of course, why am I wearing sunglasses? Obviously, because it looks cool, and probably more importantly, I am aware that when I am on camera, my eyes do funny things when I am thinking, and that makes me self-conscious. So just like Roy Orbison and many other handsome rock stars, I am wearing sunglasses, and it's my podcast, and I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not hurting anybody, and I don't think these sunglasses are hurting anybody. So, John Scalzi. If you're not familiar with John Scalzi, he's a popular science fiction writer known for the Old Man's War series and the novel Red Shirts. His debut book is something I really like, called Agent to the Stars. This novel, When the Moon Hits Your Eye, is 336 pages long. The publisher is Tor Books. It was published this year, 2025. And my first impression of this book was, I don't think I'm going to read this. I bought it as an audiobook. I listened to the first chapter, and I thought, this premise is ridiculous, and John Scalzi, if you're not going to take this seriously, I'm not going to take you seriously. So a few weeks went by, and then I found myself with a gap between books, nothing to read, and it was kind of late at night, and I was just kind of looking to read something until I could relax and fall asleep. So I started it again, and the second time through, I would say it hooked me. And the first moment that hooked me was a chapter that was rendered entirely as a Reddit thread about whether or not people were noticing that the moon had gotten a lot brighter. Now, I should probably just say, this novel has a bizarre and ridiculous premise, and I don't think it's a spoiler to give it away. The premise is the whole book, and the premise is that the moon has turned into cheese. What kind of cheese? Nobody knows. Scalzi keeps that deliberately vague. It's a kind of running joke. But the moon is now cheese. And the way that people notice this is that moon samples, moon rocks in museums are also now cheese. And the moon is suddenly a lot brighter because it is lighter colored. And it's slightly larger, which means that eclipses are more likely to occur. I'd say the first chapter where I actually started to feel like, you know what, there's something kind of neat about this book was a man in a diner story. It's a bunch of men in a diner in Oklahoma being interviewed by a reporter, and the men in the diner turn out to be far more erudite and thoughtful than one normally imagines men in diners to be. As you go through the book, you start to gradually realize, oh, this is in fact a novel, but it's also kind of like a series of short stories about characters, some of whom reappear, many of whom do not, some of whom have relationships with one another, many of whom do not. So if you see it as just a kind of series of chapters about different characters who are all reacting to this existential, bizarre occurrence, the moon turning into cheese, in different ways, that ends up being really, really fun. And I'll say, to escalate the stakes, essentially the moon calves off a giant piece of cheese, which, you see this coming, is heading for Earth and is going to kill all of us. Yes, humanity is going to be wiped out by being buried in cheese. That's the premise. That is the existential crisis that all of these characters are dealing with, and they all deal with it in different ways, some of which are admirable, some of which are quite amusing, some of which are not admirable. Another chapter I really enjoyed was about two estranged brothers who own competing cheese shops in Madison, Wisconsin's Capitol Square. That chapter ends more or less in the way that you might expect or see coming, but the way it gets there is clever and heartwarming. There's another chapter about an aspiring young science fiction writer, a young woman. There's a chapter that's, as I said earlier, just a Reddit thread. There's a chapter that's a kind of fun and funny and ultimately heartwarming group text thread, I think, or maybe it's a Slack channel, something like that. And the book ends up being this kind of celebration of ordinary people in America, particularly nerdy, ordinary people, and the sort of quiet heroism and nobility that people like that can have in certain crisis situations. There's also a hilarious chapter about a billionaire space cadet who essentially hijacks the spacecraft that he has built for NASA so that he can be the first man to return to the moon since, the 70s. I won't tell you how it ends, but it ends in a way that is sort of, well, I won't tell you how it ends. And the next chapter is a bunch of nerdy high school students talking about the events of the prior chapter, and that is quite amusing. You know, this premise is absurd, but it is an experimental novel. It's experimental in form. It's, let's take an absurdist premise, let's just declare it, let's not explain it, and then let's do a series of loosely related chapters about how people deal with that particular premise. And as such, it kind of reminds me of kind of like a bubblegum, soda fountain, watered down version of Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad. I don't think that it has the narrative precision of Jennifer Egan. I don't think it has the lyrical prose that Jennifer Egan has. Egan also has a fascination with some real dark parts of human character that Scalzi maybe alludes to but doesn't really dive into. But it does have moments of real heart, and it is experimental in an interesting way. Would I say this is one of my favorite John Scalzi novels? No. I would say my favorites are his debut, Agent to the Stars, which I think is a masterful Douglas Adams-like satire set in Los Angeles. I really like Red Shirts. I won't spoil the premise of that one. I like the first Old Man's War novel. And there were a couple of others of his novels that I also like too. I will say that his most recent novels, this is the third in a series of novels that are not really related, but he says are thematically related. I don't think they're as strong as his earlier works. I think sometimes I sense that this is somebody who is writing to fulfill the terms of a multi-book contract that he signed a few years ago. Sometimes the novels feel that way. But I still think this just barely qualifies as a good book. It's like he is a baseball player who takes a swing at a pitch that he probably should have laid off. He doesn't get good contact, but he hits a dribbler down the third baseline and then just legs it out with a lot of heart, making it a base hit, sort of the way that, Tom Berenger's character does at the very end of Major League. He just kind of guts it out with some sweet moments and some heart. So I'm going to give this book 3 stars out of 5, which means it's good. Better than I expected after that first chapter. If you haven't read Scalzi, I would not suggest that you start with this. Read Red Shirts, read Agent to the Stars, read Old Man's War, and decide if you want to keep going. But if you already really like Scalzi and you enjoy his facility with dialogue, I do think he's one of the great dialogue writers of all time, like right up there with Nora Ephron and Herman Mankiewicz. I think you'll probably enjoy this one too. So that was my review of Agent to the Stars by John Scalzi. This has been Upper Middlebrow. Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Jesse Dukes and Chris Bagg are the rival shop owners of Capitol Square under the watchful gaze of Miss Forward, a.k.a. Lady Wisconsin. You can look all that up. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. We are supported by Jenny Grieve and Justin Reich. And a reminder, Chris and I are both writers and editors and can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbagg.com and jessedukes.com.